Hey guys, what's going on? It's your boy the Mana Shark here, and I just wanted to do a very quick deck tech on the Gruul Aggro Deck that I ran all the way in best of 3. Ooh, this is the wrong deck. Ooh. Hey guys, what's going on? It's your boy the Mana Shark here, and today I just wanted to show you a Gruul build that I just grinded all the way to Mythic a couple of days ago with. And just go through the deck, talk about sideboarding, and how to grind this thing all the way to Mythic. So just to go through the main deck first, we have 2 Shock, very solid card, very great in the obvious matchups. Red deck wins, mono blue, not as good against similar mid-range decks, and really good surprisingly against Team Reclamation and that sort of stuff. With the Nexus of Fates and Fogs and all that, because Fog can't stop a Shock, and you could knock them down to 2 pretty easy. So 3 Direfleet Daredevil, a card that it's very easy to think greedy with it, where you, even though you could play it on turn 2, you sandbag it all the way into the later game, and that is a play if you have another 2-drop. But if you just have it on turn 2, just drop it if you don't have anything else going on. 2/1 first strike does a lot in a lot of matchups, including red deck wins and mono blue. We have 4 Growth Chamber Guardians. Growth Chamber Guardian just being a fantastic beater. People don't realize it, but it actually kind of can win a game on its own, especially if you're pulling all of them out of your deck. It's very hard to lose. In matchups where they have a Growth Chamber Guardians, sure, like that won't do it. But this card is fantastic. Applying very early pressure without committing to the board too much. Fantastic against control. 2 Gruul Harpooner. You can play the elf, the 2/3 elf that once targeted, make an elf instead if you're expecting a lot of control and a lot of mono red. But in most metas, Gruul Harpooner is fantastic, taking out flyers like Krasis, their Rekindling Phoenixes, Drakes. It's just a all-around great versatile card, a solid beater, and if it gets haste by any way, like through a card in your sideboard, Domri, it could be a huge attacker, which is really funny. We have 4 Zertog Goblins. This card is a little greedy with the mana base. It's also not a warrior in a deck that its mana base thrives on warriors. However, it's a really strong beater. But it's arguable as to whether or not it belongs on the deck list. I've had great experiences with it in a lot of control matchups. Having an early 3/3 or a hasty 2/2 later on is fantastic. We have 2 Lava Coil, a card that's really strong in the meta against Phoenixes, against Drakes, against lots of recurring threats, as well as just creatures of big toughness, right? Absolutely happy with it. And then we have 4 Lightning Strike, a card that I'm a little bit less impressed with, but it's a solid removal spell, gets some face damage in, and can often help finish off the game. We got 4 Goblin Chain Whirlers, the classic. It seems a little greedy in a 2-color deck to be rocking it, but with so many red-green dual lands and with unclaimed territory, naming Warrior, it's very possible to cast Goblin Chain Whirler on turn 3, no problem. And then we have 4 Gruul Spellbreaker, a fantastic card. Whether it's dropping a chunky 4/4 or in the control matchups, most of the time getting a hasty 3/3 out there, it's fantastic and has a lot of versatility, even though it's literally just choose a 4/4 or a 3/3 haste. And the fact that they can't interact with it on your turn means if a control deck or someone is trying to hold up mana and interacts with your next play, this surprises them. It's an easy 3 damage, which is very relevant in the Esper control matchup. Then we have 3 Collision Colossus, a card that in game 1 is fantastic. As they board more removal, it usually comes out. Deals with flyers really well against decks like Mono Blue Control, against decks with angels in them, against other mid-range decks with not a lot of removal. The +4/+2 is disastrous. It could absolutely destroy your opponent. And with all your first strikers, there's a lot of tricks there, making sure that your Chain Whirler becomes a 7/5 first strike and can just eat like a Carnage Tyrant. It really gets people. It's a fantastic card. but does come out fairly often. And then we have 4 Rekindling Phoenix, a card that, in a deck with no card advantage, this is kind of one, and that's a 2-for-1. And it's great. It flies over a lot of other mid-range decks when we get a little stuck. It's really hard to deal with, and in controlled matchups, you can really find ways to match it up so they basically have to have a Vraska's Content or they're in big trouble. So it's a powerhouse. And then just 8 mountains, 2 forests, 2 Gruul Gilgate, an essential, necessary but evil, 4 Rootbound Crag, 4 Stomping Ground, and 4 Unclaimed Territory. So going through the sideboard, and we'll talk about some notes regarding them. We got 2 Shivan Fire, whether it's for the mono blue matchup or we just want earlier instant speed interaction, and that's an opportunity to board them in. Or we just know we're going to be shocking creatures all the time, and we want a way to upgrade it to bigger creatures. Shivan Fire is a fantastic card to do that. We got 2 Status Stature, a card that I'm still on the fence about, honestly. So you can't actually cast Statute, right? But Status, if you target your Goblin Chain Whirler with the trigger on the stack, you just wipe your opponent's board. And in a mid-range game, it's a Plague Winds, right? It's fantastic. But it's very hard in a deck with no card advantage to assemble that 2-card combo. So I'm falling a little bit less on that card, but I see a lot of pros still rocking it. So I'm willing to keep trying it. And then we have 2 Lava Coil. In certain matchups, like if they're rocking Rekindling Phoenix or they're playing bigger creatures, Lava Coil, you bring that in. 4 Cindervines. Cindervines are so good against Reclamation decks because it takes it out. It's great against control decks because it makes all their spells hurt them. If you watch the gameplay, there's actually a really funny game where I dropped 2 of these out against a control deck, and it's like, how do you function, right? There's not a lot of ways to remove it in control decks other than the Mortify, and it just gets a lot done against them and against Reclamation, which is, Esper Control and Reclamation. If you play Arena, those are 2 huge players in the best of 3, and I highly recommend playing best of 3. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Domri, so as you mentioned before, it combos well with Crawl Harpooner for some really huge hasty damage. It gets some value in fetching more creatures, and should you get there, it ultimates. But honestly, if you're able to keep pumping it up like that and keep activating it with no interruption, it's probably just the better play to just keep minusing, because it's more likely to get that going off and to get accrue value that way than to get it all the way up to 8 and then minus it before Vraska's Content comes and hits it. Then we have 2 Vivian Reed in control matchups and in matchups where your opponent's playing Krasis, and usually that's the same thing, but mid-range matchups, you bring it in. Game 1s could sometimes be too slow, which is why I don't rock it in the main. You can rock it in the main, absolutely, but I've been very happy with it in the sideboard, coming in a lot, a fair amount, yeah, but not always. There are some faster matchups that I'd rather not have it. We have 1 Carnage Tyrant. I honestly just didn't have 2, but I've been happy with the 1 Carnage Tyrant and 1 Banefire, which can be replaced with the 2nd Carnage Tyrant, as just uncounterable threats to end your opponent. We're not here building up a ton of mana, so Banefire is not as good, but we just want a little bit more against the control decks, especially against the more of the Reclamation builds. So let's talk a little bit about the sideboard notes just a tad more. Generally speaking, we have a very versatile sideboard with not a lot of gaps, right? I would say our worst matchups is probably against like red deck wins. Might be a little bit of a toughie just because their curve is lower. White Weenie, because they can hit the ground really fast. Mono blue is tricky but doable. I think we have a really solid matchup. Honestly, there aren't a ton of matchups that I don't like. The only matchup I would say we're not favored in at all is the Sultai mid-range matchup. That's something we definitely struggle with. And you could tune up the build to like fit that matchup a little bit better. The reality is like we're better than aggro decks because we're an aggro deck with some good mid game, whereas a Sultai, you know, a very dedicated mid range deck like Sultai mid range, their mid game is like 1,000 times better. So we definitely struggle in that matchup. But other than that, like this deck crushes control, crushes reclamation, beats mono red, beats mono white fairly well, and beats mono blue pretty heavily. So I highly recommend this deck for grinding for Mythic. Why do I use best 2 out of 3 and not best of 1? I think I just have a very sour experience with best of 1. The reality is, if you're only playing one game, all it takes is a bad hand. All it takes is being on the draw, and all of a sudden, like, you're not gonna win simply because of a coin flip, or you know, like it's not a ton in your control. As you add more games into the match, and as you add the element of skill, that's sideboarding, all of a sudden, best of 3 is actually just a way better way to grind, right? Best of 1, you only get one little peg thingy for every win. Best of 3, when you win 2 games, you get 2 pegs. So in that sense, it is just as good. However, if you do lose a match 1-2, you don't get I think you still lose 2 pegs. I don't think you only lose 1. So there's that slight downside. But best 2 out of 3 definitely rewards the skill, and this deck definitely thrives off of having just a really solid, versatile sideboard. There are some other cards you can consider for the build. There's the 5-mana dragon that you can throw in there. I don't think it's too necessary, but I see a lot of people throwing in there. And they're definitely like these status statue. I think are very questionable. I think that's something we could consider, and Rhythm of the Wild. Is definitely a card that we also have to consider consider playing as well against. But I think our control matchup right now, at least in this meta, is very, very strong. And so, with that being said, hope you enjoyed this little deck tech here. Let me know if you have any questions. If you're trying this out and there is any matchup you're struggling with. Are there any cards in the next set that you're really excited to try out within this build? Or are there any decks you want to see me play through Mythic, whether it's just to mess around or to really try to grind some numbers? I'm all ears. So anyway, this is the Mana Shark. Thank you for watching. Be sure to drop a like if this was helpful for you, and peace.